Today, we're diving straight into the life and, honestly, the staggering contradictions of Thomas Jefferson. We're going to use the hard historical facts to unpack a deeply, deeply complex legacy. Because, this isn't just your standard story about a founding father. It's a real, unfiltered look at a man whose soaring rhetoric literally shaped a nation, but whose personal life, well, it often stood in direct opposition to those very words.
Right. Let's kick things off with a quote you absolutely know. It's from the Declaration of Independence, and it perfectly captures his highest ideals of liberty. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's a beautifully crafted sentence, right? It became the literal moral bedrock of the United States. But against those soaring words, we have a stark historical reality. 600. That's the number of enslaved people Thomas Jefferson owned over the course of his lifetime. 600. That is the most of any American president. So how in the world do we reconcile the author of the Declaration of Independence with a lifelong slave owner? Well, to figure out how these facts coexist, we really need to trace his life right back to the beginning.
So let's start by looking at his roots as a highly complex founding father.
Born on April 13, 1743, to a planter and surveyor, Jefferson's path was, for all intents and purposes, set from youth. When his father passed away, a 14-year-old Thomas inherited 30 enslaved individuals. So, before he ever even started his career in law and public service, he was already deeply entrenched in the system of slavery. After finishing his education at the College of William and Mary, he went all in on the affluent planter lifestyle at his Monticello plantation with his wife, Martha. They had 6 children together, though tragically only 2 survived to adulthood.
Now, let's fast forward a bit to the drafting of the Declaration.
When Jefferson was elected to the Continental Congress in 1776, he didn't just pull the Declaration's ideas out of thin air. No way. He was actually synthesizing the intellectual DNA of Enlightenment thinkers, guys like John Locke, Montesquieu, and George Mason. He used their writings to formulate that iconic line about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Basically, he was bringing together the absolute most progressive philosophy of his entire era.
But after the Revolution broke out, he didn't just stay on the national stage. He moved back to state politics and worked tirelessly in the Virginia House of Delegates to revise state laws and draft a brand new state constitution. He proudly authored a bill in 1786 establishing religious freedom, which was a massive achievement for civil rights back then. He even put in 2 one-year terms as the governor of Virginia.
Next up, let's explore his time in diplomacy and his relationship with the Hemingses.
Just before leaving for France as a U.S. minister, he published a treatise on his home state called Notes on the State of Virginia. And wow, this document perfectly captures his divided mindset. In it, he actually argued for the gradual emancipation of the state's enslaved population. But then, in the exact same text, he perpetuated these deeply harmful racial prejudices about the supposed inferiority of African Americans. It's a striking contradiction.
And this duality absolutely followed him to Paris. He brought his daughters and 2 enslaved siblings from Monticello, James and Sally Hemings, along with him. But here is the critical twist, guys. Slavery was illegal in France. Because they were technically free on French soil, Jefferson suddenly found himself in a position where he actually had to negotiate with them to ensure they'd return to the U.S. James leveraged this situation to eventually bargain for his freedom, and Sally negotiated special privileges for herself and her family before agreeing to head back to Virginia. While in France, Jefferson entered into a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, fathering at least 6 of her children. And this number here, 4, that represents the number of those children who survived to adulthood. Notably, those 4 individuals were later freed by the former president, which just adds yet another incredibly complex layer to his lifelong involvement in the institution of slavery.
Okay, moving on to the rise of partisanship.
So Jefferson heads back to the States and accepts an invitation to serve as President George Washington's Secretary of State. But man, he quickly ran into a brick wall named Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. And this wasn't just some minor workplace disagreement. They clashed bitterly over the national debt, they fought over where the permanent capital city should be located, and they totally disagreed on America's diplomatic relationship with France. This intense rivalry over finance and diplomacy is what ultimately sparked the birth of the two-party system in America.
This fierce partisan conflict basically propelled Jefferson to emerge as the leader of the new Democratic Republicans. He ended up leaving Washington's cabinet in 1793, rode his political momentum to become vice president under John Adams in 1796, and then, 4 years later, he defeated both Adams and Aaron Burr. So, on March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson officially assumed the presidency.
That brings us to his time expanding the nation.
The sheer scale of his greatest presidential achievement, the Louisiana Purchase, is honestly staggering. He acquired 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River from France for a mere $15 million. Think about that for a second. In one single diplomatic stroke, he completely doubled the size of the young nation, setting up the United States for massive westward expansion throughout the 19th century. It was a total game changer.
However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. His presidency was also marked by some serious economic turmoil. See, he was hyper-focused on reducing the national debt, which he did by aggressively slashing military budgets and cutting expenditures. But as the Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe, his diplomatic attempt to keep the U.S. out of the conflict completely backfired. He opted to enact a highly unpopular embargo that closed American ports. And the result? It crippled foreign trade and absolutely devastated American merchants, businesses, and industries.
Now, even his domestic life in the White House reflected that lifelong duality we've been talking about. Drawing on his time in France, he really preferred European tastes. He hired a French chef, a butler, and several white domestic workers. Yet, side by side with these paid laborers, he actually brought 3 enslaved teenagers up from Monticello just to train them in the art of French cooking. He also hired out several enslaved individuals from local Washington slave owners to help run the executive mansion.
Let's look at his complicated final legacy. After retiring to Monticello, he spent his remaining years tending to the daily, intricate operations of his plantation and hosting esteemed guests. He also devoted his brilliant mind to planning and founding the University of Virginia. He lived a long life, reaching the age of 83, and passed away on an incredibly poetic date, July 4, 1826. That is exactly, down to the day, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Wild, right?
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really crucial question to chew on. We've looked at the data, the timeline, the very real human decisions he made. How do these disparate facts, the visionary statesman who championed human liberty on one hand and the lifelong slave owner who relied on human bondage on the other, come together to define the American story? It's a profound contradiction for sure, and reflecting on it impartially is absolutely essential to understanding not just his legacy, but the incredibly complex foundation of the nation itself. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history around you.